Okay. Welcome everybody today to our Civics and Citizenship Professional Learning session. My name's Laura, I'm the Executive Officer of Social Education Victoria, and with me today is Adam Brodie-McKenzie, who'll be presenting this professional learning for us. Before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but I know that there's people zooming in from all across Victoria, so I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the land on which we're all learning today. Acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that we're really grateful to be continuing a tradition of learning that's existed on this land for a millennia. So you're in for a little bit of a treat. Adam is an extremely experienced civics and citizenship educator. He teaches civics and citizenship as well as politics and VCE legal studies at University High School. He's also pursuing a doctorate focusing on civics education. He's got a keen interest in student agency and so works a lot with the Victoria SRC. I've looked recently at his CV and it's very daunting. And so we're in very good hands. He's going to be sort of giving us a little bit of context to the Civics and Citizenship Curriculum to start us off. He's then going to be looking at some contemporary issues and then also talking a little bit about student-led learning and how that might work for civics. So there'll be heaps of time to ask questions at the end of each of those sections. And if you'd prefer your voice or face to not be recorded, just pop your question into the chat and I will ask that question for you. But I'll go over to Adam now to get us started. So thank you so much, Adam.
Cool, thanks, Laura. Yeah, that was quite an intro, thanks. Okay, so what I want to start actually, guys, is provoking you a little. I just want you to jot down for yourselves on a notepad or in a Word doc real quick. In terms of thinking about active citizenship, if you could change one thing in your school, your local community, state, country, or the world, what would it be? Now you might have lots, so just pick one, and you might be conscious of the background to which I'm asking this question. That would be the physical background that I'm asking this question from. Because I think one of the things that's really important, going back to my first slide, is acknowledging just how important civics and citizenship is to the world right now. Democracy is under crisis. There's a real sense of how do we work out what's true. If we can be motivated, hundreds of people can be motivated to storm the Congress in the US, or and then in Myanmar a month later, a military junta is using the same language to dispose a democratically elected leader. We need to be able to work out what's going on. And we're also surrounded by the fact that, I know for me anyway, at the school that I am at, I'm teaching activists. I'm teaching people who I know had left school a couple of years ago to go to climate strikes, who went to the Black Lives Matter protests last year. And so when teaching civics and citizenship too, it's important to think about the fact that you're teaching activists, but you're also, if you're teaching people like I am, there's also just some really apathetic young people as well. So what can we do about this, and how can we address this? So we're going to be covering a lot, and today the blurb for today's session was quite all encompassing. So I will be going through the curriculum that we are required to teach under the Victorian Curriculum, and teasing that out a bit, and feel free to ask any questions about that. And then moving on to teaching contemporary issues and how that fits with the curriculum, but also the tension that can emerge from teaching controversial issues in that space. And then lastly, giving a quick overview of the Year 10 electives that we run at University High School, that concentrates on student-centered learning and student voice. So I also just wanted to have us think about civics and citizenship education just a bit outside the curriculum as well. So like Laura said, I am currently doing my doctorate in this area. And I think there are useful bits when sort of looking at this intellectually, as well as looking at what we're sort of doing in the classroom. So one thing that's really important about civics and citizenship education is that for many see it as part of democratic education, although not exclusively so. Probably the country that has the most well-established civics and citizenship education would be China. But if you are someone who does see even the purpose of education to be creating citizens and potentially active and informed citizens, then you can see how this subject goes to like the very purpose of everything that we're doing in education. And so that then links to sort of broader purposes about education as well. Like, why are we teaching young people? There are tensions that exist in civics and citizenship to do with, should we just be teaching students the core subjects that they need to be able to, say, vote, or to be able to participate locally or know who their local member is? Or should we be teaching them to be justice-oriented citizens, like actual activists? And should we be, as teachers, should we be doing that? And that then gets tied up in all kinds of ideas of social justice and empowerment as well, because you can see empowerment as social justice, but it can also be seen within a sort of a neoliberal model of the consumer and the consumer's rights, and that students are consumers, and how they can achieve what they want as consumers in this world. So there's a lot of different intellectual and ideological traditions going on in this subject, and we haven't even walked into the classroom yet. Yeah, like Laura said, so I'm a learning specialist in student agency at my school. So student agency is definitely something that I care a lot about. And I think it's also important that if you're teaching in a Victorian school, and particularly in a government school, that cultivating student voice and agency and leadership is now very much part of what's required in the framework for improving student outcomes. So if your principals are scratching their head and thinking, oh, I don't know how to make sure that I'm achieving FISO, you can let them know that civics and citizenship education is here to save the day. I also just broadly wanted to give you the pedagogies that are considered to be most useful when teaching civics and citizenship education. There's been quite a lot of research in this area. In general, so there's these two educational philosophers, Paulo Freire and John Dewey, and they're all about experiential learning. And also Freire wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and his point really is to try to help students as oppressed citizens to rise up against their oppressors. And he sees the purpose of education as sort of linking to that. So, you can sort of get behind those, again, strong ideological viewpoints if you want. Although if you also just want to take a step back, they've been known that in the civics and citizenship classroom, just doing things like having an open classroom environment where students feel free and safe to be able to speak and share their views is seen as incredibly important. Some form of experiential learning in this space. So not just learning the facts of the area, but if they can live it. And that can be anything from, say, a mock parliament you could be doing in your classroom, to visiting parliament, to trying to make a particular change in your school, for example. Also that the sort of across the board, there is also this idea of critical reflection. So this can be difficult for all of us, really, but to try to help students develop that critical and creative thinking that is important sort of for all their learning, but particularly in this area as it relates to their citizenship and being citizens in the world. I think what's great is I hope amongst this community of all of us now that we can progress together, to be honest, because another thing that a lot of the research and policies are showing is that there is a real need in this area for specialist teachers, skilled specialist teachers that know what they're teaching. So maybe even just at this point, does anyone have any questions about sort of that overall scope of CCE before I move on?
Isn't necessarily regarding the scope, but there has been a question in the chat, Adam, which I know that you'll be addressing, looking at your topics for later on, but how can I create interest amongst staff and particularly students to introduce a Year 10 subject called politics when there is strong apathy and indifference from the school community? And I think this is one of the conundrums that like many of the teachers that we speak with are experiencing, because as you mentioned, you've got a group of students in your class and some of them might be activists and some of them don't really know why they should care yet.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a, so Connor, I mean, I'd probably want to know a little more about your context. I think that, so the way that I got my Year 10 elective up, because I was sort of you a few years ago, was two ways. One, I said, well, it's a mandatory subject in the Victorian curriculum. That can be useful. It's also a feeder subject into VCE politics, VCE legal studies, and VCE sociology. And so if your school is like mine and is very much about those ATAR results, then you can say, well, let's teach the students the things in Year 10 that will get them the top marks in Year 12. And so it's sort of doing an injustice to them if we're waiting until Year 11 to be the first time that they're learning these things. So I sort of found those two arguments to be helpful, which is sort of, we need to be following the rules, and also don't schools like getting high marks, I suppose. I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's just general apathy. Yeah, people just, it's like I'm talking to a wall sometimes amongst staff, students, and yeah, I just feel that many students are we're doing them a disservice. There's no subject called Year 10 politics, and I even look at I'll be 20 seconds, even just subject of humanities, just the subject of humanities, it's maybe 2 or 3 periods a week, and that's it. What can you learn in 3 periods a week? When English, maths have 5, 6 periods, look, yeah, I don't want to go over your topic, but yeah, it's just the whole domain of humanities is just being watered down, and that's really sad. That's really sad.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, look, I have a similar thing happening with humanities. I imagine most of us do. I think one thing possibly is maybe don't call it politics. So, I mean, I was going to call the subject originally activism. The principal was a bit scared about that. It's now called democracy and justice. Students sort of care a little bit more about justice than they do about politics. So, I think there's sort of an advertising element as well. And, it is out there now that there's a lot more, young people are more politically aware. Maybe they just don't know that they are. So you can sort of lead them along.
And there's another really great suggestion in the chat at the moment, which is about incursions and excursions for key groups of students can be a good catalyst to get interest in global politics. Like I know the suggestions in the chat are high resolves and the AEF, but also things like trips to Parliament, things like trips out into the community can really help as well. And we can talk more about different incursions and excursions that we could plan as part of our civics course a bit later on.
Yeah, I'll definitely be bringing that up actually a bit later. All right, well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it then. So I guess importantly, I just wanted to give a bit of a scope of the country in terms of where it's sitting with curriculum, and particularly sort of maybe highlighting New South Wales. They don't do civics and citizenship at all. They're told that it's going to be learnt across the curriculum, which is very different to the Victorian curriculum. The Victorian curriculum says that it needs to be taught from levels 3 to 10. I think one of the interesting things about the different curriculums, though, is that we are teaching politics, and that curriculum itself can be political. And in the Australian curriculum, there's a noticeable difference in the aims to do with what it's trying to achieve, which isn't, no easy feat. A lifelong sense of belonging to and engagement with civic life as an active and informed citizen in the context of Australia as a secular democratic nation with a dynamic, multicultural and multi-faith society. And then in the Australian curriculum, they added a few years ago, and a Christian heritage. So within the Victorian curriculum, we're dealing with 3 strands. That's government and democracy, law and citizens, citizenship, diversity and identity. And it's not a perfect fit, but government and democracy does lead to politics in VCE, law and citizens, the legal studies, and citizenship, diversity and identity to sociology. I guess the other important thing to note is that in the Victorian curriculum, we have levels, not years. So you can be meeting the requirements of the Victorian curriculum if you just had a civics and citizenship unit in years 8 and 9, and you covered levels 7 to 10 in just those 2 years. So there's a lot more flexibility in the Victorian curriculum than the Australian curriculum in terms of those levels. It's also likely that you're going to be, if you're starting this in a secondary school, that you might end up talking about levels 5 and 6, or even 3 and 4, in order to sort of get those building blocks towards 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. So these are the achievement standards, and these are the most important things. So we'll look at the particular strands in a second, but really by the end of level 10, level 8, level 6, this is what they're hoping students will have been able to achieve by learning the Victorian curriculum. Importantly, in the achievement standards, down the bottom, they all talk about action and being active and informed citizens, which doesn't actually appear in the individual strands, but is obviously an important part. So in 5 and 6, they've got identify possible solutions to an issue as part of a plan for action. 7 and 8, they identify ways they can be active and informed citizens and take action in different contexts. And then in 9 and 10, students evaluate a range of factors that sustain democratic societies and analyse ways they can be active and informed citizens in different contexts, taking into account multiple perspectives and ambiguities. So they're really building on each other. So in an ideal with an ideal program, you'd be sort of building on those as you're going through the levels. So I just want to take a little bit of a deep dive into one of the achievement standards, just to get an understanding of how that then breaks down into the strands. So this is the level 7-8 achievement standard, and then these are sentences that then break up into the different strands. So the first sentence here in green is related to government and democracy. The part in red is related to law and citizens, and the unhighlighted part at the end is in citizenship, diversity and identity. So then out of those achievement standards, it then turns into these. So again, this is just the level 8 strands, and it starts to give more specific ideas about what you could be looking at. So with government and democracy, we've got, say, describe the process of constitutional change through a referendum. Now, to my mind, there is a part of the curriculum here where it is asking a lot of year 8s, particularly, say, the very first one in the top left, describe the key features of government under the Australian Constitution, including the separation of powers, the executive, the role of the Houses of Parliament and the division of powers. Now, if you're doing VCE legal studies, you're doing that in year 12. So you're doing that in Unit 4. So there is a way to try to think about more how can you expose the students to the idea of the Constitution, I think the ideas of Parliament, that rather than sort of really getting into the weeds on these ideas, because I know that my Year 12 legal studies students struggle with this, and Year 8s as well. It can be hard to grasp with these abstract ideas, which will sort of lead to the program later. So what I want to do now is I want to show you how looking at a particular contemporary issue to do with Indigenous Australians at level 8, but it's actually all throughout the Victorian curriculum. There's a lot of useful parts, particularly in level 9 and 10 as well, to do with Indigenous Australians and Indigenous issues. So how you can sort of use just one topic to cover many areas of the Victorian curriculum. But before I do that, just does anyone have any questions about the Victorian curriculum itself?
Maybe there'll be more at the end. Adam, let's move on.
All right, let's kick on then. All right, so teaching contemporary issues. So there's I mean, probably the two biggest issues that are going on in the world today, or at least for the last years, would be climate change and Black Lives Matter. As that is coming out of my mouth, I am realizing that this week has been a big week in terms of talking about consent and sexual assault. So there's certainly that's emerging as well, and so I think covering that will probably be you know, a useful and a good idea soon. But certainly Black Lives Matter isn't going anywhere soon. So what I want to show, I guess, is the scope that you can do by sort of looking at Black Lives Matter. The very first thing I'd say is I understand some of you, Sue, you're starting this in term 3, but something to think about is if you're doing a year-long civics unit, or maybe even starting the year, if you're doing a humanities unit with civics and citizenship, because we have this circumstance where every single year, it's Australia Day, Invasion Day has just happened, and there will always, well, unless we change the date, I suppose, or something else happens, there'll always be the opportunity of engaging with the topic of Invasion Day and linking that in terms of Black Lives Matter in Australia. And the great thing about I realize I'm being positive about something that isn't necessarily too positive, but the great thing about Invasion Day is that it also can link to all of the strands and all levels quite well. So you can look at Indigenous incarceration rates and justice. You can link that with Black Lives Matter and what's going on in the US. In Victoria too, they're organising a treaty at the moment. There's always the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which can then send you on a road to talking about constitutional recognition for Indigenous people, which can introduce students to the Constitution. If they're saying, what can we do? You can introduce, writing letters to local MPs, looking at you can look at the makeup of our parliament and the people that sit in our parliament and how that could be relevant. And then also what is the place of protest in democracy? And so it's an incredibly rich area that every calendar year, every school year is starting with this. So something to think about in terms of in terms of a contemporary issue. I also wanted to sort of, I guess, sit with this for a moment, in that, you know, civics and citizenship is a really great opportunity to discuss contemporary issues, but an ongoing issue for teachers is that this might be true for you, is that there's a real awkwardness about discussing controversial issues. And so, and this becomes something that's really context dependent, right? So for example, at my school, at University High School, it would probably be controversial to call Invasion Day a controversial issue, in the same way that it would actually kind of be controversial to say that same-sex marriage is controversial, because of the environment that I'm in and the students and parents and staff at the school, that they're heavily progressive, and so and sort of bound in the idea of everyone having equal rights no matter who they are. That to think that there could be another option, they might even find that itself controversial. But on the other hand, maybe in your school, it's a completely different context. And I'm thinking in particular in relation to same-sex marriage, and if you're at a religious school of some kind. But it does also beg the question of when talking about contemporary issues, what does promoting both sides do, right? And can it create sort of false equivalence as well? And if you have students and the students are, say, openly racist, how do you respond to that? And how do you let the voices be heard? Do you let the voices be heard? Do you just quash them there and then? And so, I mean, for me, as I'm a government school teacher, so I actually lean into the Victorian public sector values and VIT in this, and use the argument of both as a public service employee and as a teacher with VIT, that inclusivity is very much at the is very much part of the work that I do, and is a part of my role as a teacher. And so it's important that I foster that inclusivity in my role. But I'd be really interested to hear where you guys sit with this. Maybe more so. I was going to give you guys an opportunity now, but maybe we can have a chat about it at the end when Laura's turned off the record button. So yeah, maybe just think about that one.
Adam, while the recording is still on, I'm happy to sort of share one of the approaches that I've seen and then have used myself. Is when we talk about human rights, there is a hierarchy, and it's kind of connected to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is that a right to free speech doesn't supersede someone's right to safety.
Mm.
And so when we're talking about rights to free speech and freedoms of expression and things like that, should that should that be of more weight than somebody's right to be safe and able to learn and able to, access equality, in terms of their schooling? Well, no, I think we can reasonably say that freedom of speech doesn't supersede people's, safety, especially the safety of the students in our class. And I thought that's a really interesting way of doing it, because then it actually starts us thinking about, well, what are our values? Because I value, the person's safety over that other right. And it's worked in those conversations, but it's also, there's so many different situations where you can feel very worried and sort of not know how to choose your words on the moment. So we can definitely open up that conversation a bit later.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd share with that in VCE legal studies. I've always, for the last couple of years, I've been teaching, or however long it's been going on, same-sex marriage. And I do remember when I started teaching it to think about both sides in it. or the relevance of letting different voices be heard. And then I just made the conscious decision that due to the safety of the students and the students that I knew that I had in that room, that wasn't going to be up for the individual worth of a kind of person or an individual wasn't actually going to be something that could be debated in my classroom. And like I said, I'm really happy for you guys to come back at me at the questions maybe at the end when these things aren't being recorded. So given that this can be an issue, this potential talking about controversial issues, I have found a way of getting around it which also fosters student-centered learning and promoting student voice and student agency. And that's to really hand over the reins of how students want to learn civics and citizenship to the students. So I'll show you sort of how I've done this in this year 10 elective. So we've been developing this for a few years now. And it's set up with two streams. One's a bit more of a standard classroom kind of, they do sort of games and worksheets and classroom discussions. And then this is running at the same time as students running their own activism project. We call it a civic action project or a CAP. These two things are running at the same time. So the first 3 units here are sort of the more traditional classroom environments, I suppose, and then the activism is a lot more them. And that being said, we do let them choose the topics that they want to research and that kind of thing in the more traditional part as well. I think I would just highlight that when we started the subject, media literacy and fake news actually wasn't a part of it, and now it's a very much core part of it. So we need to learn what, how do we know what we know, which is important. I mean, that's just important, but also as they go on and do their research in activism, they need to work out the sources that they can trust in this. Just highlighting the activism part that they do. So it sort of takes this flow that you can see on the left. So they come up with an idea that they want to change. They get together with the other students who have a similar idea. They research that. They to see what exists already. They investigate something that maybe through asking their fellow students about it, asking people in the community about it. It depends what it is. They then take actual action, and then they review to see how well did that go? Did they achieve what they want? So here are some examples of the things that students have chosen. So some of them had success, some of them didn't, and I really let them choose what they wanted. So in terms of there was a group of EAL students who actually just started up a homework club in the afternoon, and it was a peer-supported homework EAL class to help them learn English. You could argue if that's an action in activism, but they certainly saw it as very important. So I was very happy to let them pursue that. There was also a group who wanted to get rid of helmets. They just didn't want to wear helmets on their bikes anymore. That's something that I thought was really stupid. But I let them go and see if they wanted to do it and succeeding. And after sort of dabbling with sort of libertarian ideas, they also, once they got to the research phase, realized that actually maybe helmets were pretty handy, and so then changed what they were doing. I think what I've also noticed about doing this subject is something like, say, CBD homelessness or single-use plastics. This is at school. These aren't things that are exclusive to the school that I work at. And one of the things that I'm really keen to do is to try to build connections with other schools, so possibly with your schools, where students instead are able to combine and unite towards a broader sense of activism in particular areas, because I am also finding that I think a lot of the things that the students are bringing up are certainly things that that are happening across schools, not just in mine. Yeah, if that's something that interests you, please get in touch. And also, yeah, I will say though that most of the projects that the students have chosen have related to the school, and it's important to make sure that school leadership is aware of what you're doing. Not even necessarily that they need to be condoning what you're doing, but it does help for them to have an awareness of what you're doing for sort of the success of the students. Although I think a really important part, this is called YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, and a really important part of the review process is that it actually makes students realize where the power of decision making lies and who are the gatekeepers towards a particular area of decision making. Like we've had success in some areas because an assistant principal has really liked what one group was doing, where others haven't had that success because it just hasn't sort of sparked the interest of another assistant principal. And getting them to reflect on that together amongst the group that succeeded and the group that didn't succeed, to sort of end up having that conversation. One group last year just wanted to have door openers where you weren't using handles because of COVID. And that happened, I think, the week after they had the idea. They just emailed the relevant assistant principal and it had happened. So, you know, these things do depend on who you get on board. I guess the thing that I want to highlight in terms of the broad context of what I'm talking about here is obviously this fosters student agency because they get to choose whatever they want to do and collaborative practices between them all. But it does also depoliticize the classroom, because I think one of the things that civics and citizenship teachers are worried about is that they're going to come in and they're going to say the wrong thing, and the student's going to go home and they're going to say, my teacher said this, right? And one of the great things about running a program like this is that it's all student led and it's all come from the students, right? That doesn't mean you just let them go hammer and tongs, but it does mean that it does mean that a lot of the awkwardness that people can often feel when discussing controversial issues are eliminated, because this isn't sort of top-down teacher telling student how the world is. This is students finding out for themselves how the world works and how their citizenship fits within that. I think one thing that has just resonated for me ever since I started studying again was this quote by a guy called Gert Biester, which is just acknowledging the fact that actually whether we engage with young people and whether we engage with students or not as citizens and try to empower them, they are existing in the social world and in the political world anyway. And they are always sponges, and they are always working out what they can do, what they can't do, where do they fit. And they are already existing as citizens, even though they can't vote or whatever. They are already existing in the world among all of us as well. And so it's really on us, given that we have such an active part in their lives, to try to work out what we can do to ensure that we're empowering them when they're in that environment and in all of the interactions that we have with them. And that's it. Let's see, there's more.
We've had some some really great comments in the chat. So there's one comment where it was just identifying how exciting it is that the curriculum strands for civics and citizenship are actually really broad and open, which allows us sort of space to bring these issues into the class in a meaningful way. And I think what you mentioned before, Adam, about how sometimes when you go into the descriptors, it can be really daunting to look at, the structure of the executive, and that you need to know exactly the nitty-gritty of all of these different things about constitutional law. And maybe we do need to know those things and we need to skill up around those areas, but there's actually some broad brushstroke concepts that are really accessible, and that we, as we skill ourselves up in the nitty-gritty, where there's still a lot of really great work that you can do that's more about some of the more accessible parts of the curriculum and some of the bits that are more relevant, to the students where they are right now, without all of the extra bits. We've got some other comments, which is Zoya mentioned big links to units 3-4 sociology. Shout out to year 12 soc teachers who are doing area of study 1 Australian Indigenous cultures right now. How powerful for those students if they've had a really good grounding in these kind of issues at levels 7 to 10. Meg has identified she's seeing lots of links in science regarding access to resources, cultural bias, roles of governments in advocacy and science funding and things like that, in terms of issues that teachers might get into. And then we've also got some comments about there's lots of connections with literary theory as well. So if you're looking at in the English literature course, you're looking at different lenses in terms of queer, feminist, gender, post-colonial theories and things like that. And so those kinds of ways of looking at the world could really help to support students to understand those issues, which would also suggest the possibility of using poetry and literature and storybooks and things like that in civics, which as a literacy nut is very dear to my heart. And then there's just a comment there, which is really appreciate mentioning controversial issues and whether or not to stay biased, especially keeping in mind how diverse your classroom itself is, e.g. if some of us remained impartial on certain issues, perhaps a quarter of the class would completely rebel due to a lack of care and understanding. Absolutely. And I think I don't know how much of today's session will talk about this, but definitely in the session on Tuesday, we can look a little bit about context audits and looking at, who your students are and what kind of considerations might be required there to ensure really positive classroom dialogue. And I think just in terms of, the sort of skills that we want students to be able to take into the world beyond, is that we want students to be able to have conversations with people that are respectful, that are evidence-based, that are well argued, no matter what their perspective might be. And that's one of the skills that a civics course is really, really needs to prioritize.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall I stop sharing and maybe let people do it, and stop recording, and we'll let people.
And